It's just the outliers. And it's the outliers which cause this rather unpleasant exchange surgery, which is not a pleasant experience for either the patient or the surgeon. And it certainly means more sacrifice to endothelial cells. And it's just something we'd like to try and avoid. So my financial disclosure, of course, in this regard is clear. I have been working on this for about 20 years now, since 1999, when Carlo Lobisolo from Milan, who, as you know, deceased very recently of a brain tumor, he approached me when I was showing some prototype work from my ultrasound work from Cornell University. And we worked together for many, many years. In fact, a lot of our work was quoted in the 2004 FDA Ophthalmic Devices Panel meeting that led to the approval of the ICL in the States. And some of that work I'm going to include here because I'm going to talk about the history and where we're going. So I'd like to talk about the evolution of sizing. And of course, we all know that the initial sizing algorithm was very simple. You took the white to white and basically added 0.5 millimeter and picked the lens that was closest in size to that. And let's call that lens sizing version 1.0. So, of course, with a bit of more insight, and STAAR has upgraded their OCOS website to include other factors that add to the predictability of which lens to use. So obviously the size, the power of the lens is going to be related to how much it bends. Yeah, a high-powered lens is thinner in the center, so it's going to bend more than a low-powered lens. And the haptics may behave differently on the different sized lenses as well. So obviously they have this compression information, and so based on the lens that you choose, they know how much it's going to volt up based on the compression that it's going to get inside the sulcus. They found that keratometry and the anterior chamber depth were factors that predicted lens volt. And so these are included in the OCOS website. When you go and order a lens, those 4 factors are taken into account to suggest what lens for you to use, and then press the purchase button. Now, during, like I said, from 1999 on, Carlo and myself, but prior to this, Mark Rondeau and Ron Silverman at Cornell, we started doing studies using our high-frequency ultrasound systems. And we published one paper before this one in 2009, one that was published in the 90s, showing that the sulcus was not that well correlated to the angle or to the white-to-white. And we were also showing that it was only 30% of the eyes where the vertical sulcus was wider than the horizontal sulcus, so not all of them. And so this work led to some very interesting debate around the world. A couple of years ago, there was a STAAR-sponsored review article written by Mark Packer. And, well, you know, it's hard to be gentle about this article because it was just very poorly written and the statistics were incorrect. I mean, they were doing a so-called meta-analysis, but that's only valid when you compare RCTs with internal control groups, and not like this, which was comparing a bunch of hodgepodge observational trials with completely different study designs and populations. And also they used pooling of means and forest plots, which you cannot use in this context. So the statistics were just incorrect. And the conclusion it came to, if you just kind of read the beginning and the end, is that white to white is just as good as sulcus to sulcus for lens sizing. Now, it's interesting that this would be published in 2016, which is, you know, not long ago, given the fact that there were so many heavy hitters around the world, the people who put the most of these lenses in, who are even on the, you know, on the circuit talking about these lenses. they would all use ultrasound for sizing. Now, there is a way of explaining the discrepancy quite simply by saying, look, not all of the devices are the same. And Carlo did this study where he showed the repeatability of the sulcus measurements for all the different devices out on the market. And as you can see, some of these devices, they had about a 0.4 or 0.5 millimeter standard deviation in terms of repeatability. So when you think that each lens is sized about 0.5 millimeter from the next, and that the one standard deviation was 0.4 or 0.5 millimeters, well, you can completely understand why the sulcus to sulcus measurements from these devices was going to be randomly better, not better, let's say, than a white to white measurement. But if you narrow this down to devices that had better resolution, like the ViewMax or the Artemis 1, which I had in London, with which we did the work with Carlo, you know, the repeatability was much higher. And of course, now we have the commercial, since a few years, we have the commercially available Insight 100, which I have a small financial interest in, I mentioned earlier, but you know, it is a robotic 6D scanner that makes the measurements very, very easy to acquire for any technician. So whereas most of these handheld, I'm going to call them medium high frequency devices, were very user dependent. The Insight is an automatic computerized scanner. So all the scan motion is automated. And so for example, in my clinic, since I did every single scan on the Artemis 1 because I wouldn't let anyone touch my machine in case it broke. But since we have the Insight, we have all 8 nurses trained and randomly selected based on availability to do our scans. And the repeatability of this device is an order of magnitude better than that of the other machines. And I'm going to show you why this is important, because if you look at the chances of predicting the sulcus diameter, so, you know, I'm going to talk in terms of sulcus being better than white to white for now. And if we talk about the probability of predicting the sulcus diameter within 0.5 millimeter, so within 0.5 millimeter, so that the lens that you choose will be that lens. If you are outside of 0.5 millimeter in your predicting, you'll choose a different lens, right? So the error has to be less than 0.5 millimeter for the sulcus prediction from the white to white. And what we found in our published study, which was back in 2009, God, it's over 10 years ago, is that your chances of having an error of more than 0.5 diopter is 38%, so 0.5 millimeter is 38% if you're just using the white to white. Now, at that time, there were a lot of people using the Visante, which was the first anterior segment OCT device. And it was said that if you just use the angle to angle, you'll get better prediction of the sulcus. And you know what? It was better. But you still had a 32% chance of predicting the sulcus with an error greater than 0.5 millimeter, and therefore choosing a lens that was outside of the one that you should have. And we did a multivariate analysis of this. And, you know, we included age, sphere, cylinder, spherical equivalent, the white to white, the AC depth, the SIM-K, the corneal thickness, the angle diameter, and everything put in and all mushed up. In the regression analysis, the only 2 terms that survived were the AC depth and the angle diameter. So using AC depth and angle diameter, you can predict sulcus even better than just with angle diameter, but you're still going to have about 25% of the eyes outside of 0.5 millimeter of what you would have predicted the sulcus to sulcus to be, and therefore choosing a lens that's not the one that would be, let's say, the ideal lens. And of course, I'm going to underline what I said earlier again. This is a very forgiving procedure because, you know, in a particular eye, you might be okay with in this particular eye, a 12.6 or a 13.2. It's just that you'll get a volt of 400 or a volt of 650, and most of those would be acceptable within the eye. But I'm going to come to later why a power user might want to choose whether to leave a 600 volt or a 400 volt. And of course, that's out of the question in a system that depends on this level of accuracy. So I'm sorry, this is loading quite slowly. But, you know, as I've said, the power users of the ICL, generally speaking, use ultrasound to size their ICLs. And that's I think, a sort of a testament to the fact that there's something to be had in there. And I'm going to say that the lens sizing went to version, let's call it version 2.0, when Doherty took data that he had from the FDA trials and from his own private practice in LA, and he derived a table where now the sulcus to sulcus and the power of the ICL would lead to a particular recommended lens size. And let's call that 2.0. After that, Kojima in Japan said, wait a minute, there's another measurement here that relates to the separation of the lens to the ICL. And I've been using the term volt incorrectly because that's what everyone calls it. But the volt, technically speaking, is if you put the lens down inside the eye and draw a line along the foot plates, how much is it volting? The lens separation is what we're interested in as clinicians, and the lens separation will depend on the lens rise from the sulcus plate. And that was like a lot of brilliant ideas, Dr. Kojima, it's the obvious, but it's a brilliant idea. And so he has an equation which adds the sulcus to sulcus lens rise, actually, as well as the AC depth in his formula. So, we have the Insight 100, and we've, enjoyed this very much. And so we've been using this device using basically the Kojima formula, but also cross-checking it with the Doherty to make sure there aren't any big discrepancies. And with these two formulas, we figured that we were going to get better results because we were using a higher accuracy ultrasound device. Okay, so that was our assumption. Now, what we did was we ran, this is from the time that we got our Insight, our final commercially available Insight. And we started using the Insight to size our lenses. Here's the range, here's about 40 eyes that were done. We ran them through our ultrasound, but then we went and retrospectively went back and looked at as many dimensions as we could imagine we could measure from the device. So here's an ultrasound scan of a pre-op. You can see how beautifully you can delineate the ciliary body and the zonules. Here, this is the anterior zonule, and here's the main zonule. And you can, for example, we said, let's measure, obviously we've got the white to white, we've got the ICL power because we've refracted the patient. We're trying to find the size. We know from just observing someone at the slit lamp that the pupil size affects the lens separation. So these are parameters that are for free. They're available straight away. You've got them there. And from the ultrasound, we thought, okay, well, let's use the AC depth. We can maybe measure the angle within the ultrasound. We can measure the angle to angle. We can measure, obviously, the sulcus to sulcus very nicely. And we can measure the sulcus to sulcus lens rise. But we can also measure the zonule to zonule lens rise and the zonule to zonule distance. And we can also measure the diameter of the inner aspect of the ring of the ciliary body. And so with all of those measurements in place, we did a retrospectively, obviously we did a multivariate stepwise regression analysis and got a formula that we will have made available to everybody. I'll show you how to use this later. And the parameters that we use are now, there are 3 parameters that have never been used before to predict the size of an ICL. The other thing that we have done differently from the others is that we have, instead of, if you log on to the STAAR OCOS website, you get a recommended lens size. If you use the Doherty, it recommends a lens size. The Kojima has a formula which gives you an ideal lens size, and then I guess you'll go up and down from that ideal. But we thought of doing this differently. We thought of providing the users with a, sorry, the response time was a bit slow here. We thought of providing the user with a predictive volt for each of the available lens sizes. In other words, you have a particular eye, and you put the parameters in, and it tells you that if you put in a 12.1, you have a predicted lens separation of 506. If you put in a 13.7, it's a predicted of 1100 microns. So this is a very good example where you might have a young patient who has, this is the Salvivar principle, which I'll talk about later. You might have a young patient in whom you want to have a higher lens separation because they have a big anterior chamber. Or you might have an older patient, a 53-year-old or something, or 43-year-old, in whom you'd rather not 700 micron because they have a 2 point. And so giving you the predicted volt or lens separation for each lens, we think is a lot more useful. So what did we do with this? The first thing we did for this is to say, well, let's look at the results that we got with our device, with the Insight 100, using the Kojima formula. And then let's see what would have happened if we had used our new model, our new equation for those eyes. So these are the results that we got using Kojima and Doherty. Well, we got a mean of about 500. Well, that's understandable. We're usually aiming for 500. And the range, the highest to the lowest, was about 700 microns. If we look at how the other formulae would have predicted the volt, we see that the STAAR tends to oversize. And we all know this, right? The OCOS website, often we will have to go down a size from what is recommended, and people have different ways of doing that for themselves. But essentially, the STAAR tends to be a little over usually. And as you can see, the Doherty and Kojima were fairly much the same as ours, which was, and also what was a little bit disappointing for us was that the range was kind of the same, even though using a much more accurate ultrasound device than either Doherty or Kojima. So that was, a little disappointment, but, success is built on failure. And so we carried on because that was using their formulas. Now, if we think about what the model would predict if we did a leave one out analysis, and leave one out analysis is a way of testing a model with your retrospective data. And the way you do it is you do your modeling and take one of the eyes out and do the modeling and then test that eye inside the model. And then you remove the next eye and build the model and then test that eye inside the model. And so you basically take one eye out each time, build a model, and then you average the result that you would obtain with this leave one out method. So we did this, and the model predicted that the interquartile range, that's basically 50% of the eyes would have gone 225. So as you can see, a much tighter predictability of the volt. And that's the model prediction. So obviously it's not real because it was based on the data that we already had built the model on. But nevertheless, it's a useful exercise because it gives you an idea where you might be able to go with this. The other thing that was interesting, just analyzing our population that we built the model from, was that when I looked at the histogram of which lens size we were choosing, we noticed that we were more often picking the mode was actually a 13.2, but the mean was obviously somewhere in the middle between 12.6 and 13.2. So that was interesting. And so we thought, well, wait a minute. What if there was an actual ICL made by STAAR that was the mean size of the population? Because at the moment, they're not making one. That's the mean size of the population. But let's say there was. And what size would that be? Well, I don't know, but let's just put it in the middle between 12.6 and 13.2. That would be 12.9. And then we ask ourselves, if a 12.9 had been available, how often would we have chosen it in these eyes? And the answer was 35% of the time we would have chosen a 12.9. And notice how now the distribution is fairly symmetrical. So perhaps the predictability of the ICL will be even better if we were provided with a size that was closer to 12.9 than 13.2 and 12.6. So somebody's drawn something across my screen there. I don't know whether can I control that? Anybody know about this? This line that someone's drawn here? No? Is anybody there? Am I all by myself? Can I add some feedback? Are we online here? Hello? I'm getting a bit worried here. Should I be stopping?
That's fine then.
Okay. Okay. I suddenly thought I was all by myself and the connection had got cut off or something.
No, everything is fine.
Okay, very good. So someone is drawing a line across my screen, which I think is...
that was probably you with the cursor, but I cleared it.
Oh, you cleared it. Well done. Can I draw lines? I'd like to draw lines. I like to draw.
You can, but
where's my palette? All right. Well, never mind. Okay. So let's go to let's carry on then. So here we are. So if we had had a 12.9 lens, and we had used the 12.9 in 35% of the eyes, what would have been the predictability now? And the model predicts now that the interquartile range would have gone down to 185. Wow. Okay. So it tells us that using a mean eye instead of having to quantize up or quantize down would be a great idea. And let's hope that STAAR is thinking about this now. So what did we do with this? So, and I'm taking you through this story historically because I'm going to tell you what we've done and what we think is now the future. So this is all getting up to the past. So last year when we had this formula, we said, look, we need lots of eyes to make this more robust. And we basically put up the website iclsizing.com. And anybody can go to this, and there's obviously no charge for it. The only thing we ask is that you enter the data accurately, because otherwise you're entering garbage, so that you can get an accurate representation. Now, the way this works is like the ASCRS website, where depending on what data you give it, it will give you back what it can based on what you give it. So, for example, if you only have the maximum myopic sphere and the sulcus, it will give you the Doherty predicted formula. So that's just literally, that's just entering the publication calculations for you into one space. But if you can enter more information, so like if you can include the Kojima information, the anterior chamber depth, the sulcus to sulcus, it'll give you the Kojima. And if you enter all of the information required, then it will give you the London Vision Clinic nomogram that we've got. And it will, and for example, the Nakamura is in there as well if you enter the anterior chamber width measured from scleral spur to scleral spur with an OCT. So you can have a one-stop shop and print this as a nomogram for design. Let's just go back to one of the things I said earlier I'd like to underline, and that is that this technology is amazing. Clinically, it's amazing. So we're correcting up to -18 with 4 diopters of SIL, and the results are incredible. You have basically practically every eye is at least 90%, 89% of these eyes are either the same as their glasses pre-op or better. And this is the largest number of gain lines you can get, because obviously these are very high myopes. So we're getting a ton of magnification, no loss of lines, of course, unless you get a cataract. Those are very rare now. And the predictability is just off the charts for this level of myopia. 100% within a diopter, 83% within a half diopter, just incredible. And not that incredible when you consider the fact that the ICL is basically, you know, unlike the cornea is not a piece of plastic, right? The ICL, it is a piece of plastic. So if you're very good at refraction, you're going to get very good visual results. The cylinder correction, I find extraordinarily good. I mean, here is a vector analysis showing just how amazing this is at correcting cylinder with very, very little rotational errors. We use both the Callisto and the Alcon Varion. We've got both systems on our microscope. The contrast sensitivity for this lens, of course, you all know this, but we've measured it and we're going to publish this. The contrast sensitivity is increased in most frequencies because now they're not looking through these very thick spectacles, which decrease quality of vision. And you know, this is the good news, and so this is why I'm so excited about this, because the outcomes of this device, the ICL, are so fantastic. And the thing that's holding back this thing from exploding around the world in terms of acceptability is this outlier, the sizing, the outlier problem, and the fear that surgeons have of lenses that are too big or too small. So I wanted to come back to a thing that I mentioned earlier, and Roberto Saldívar, who I think is on the call, you know, he introduced this concept a while back, you know, of you don't always want to aim for a 500 volt. That's not the ideal volt. It's the generic ideal volt, but you're going to want to determine the volt based on the age, which is going to take into account the crystalline lens growth over time. So the crystalline lens gets bigger as you get older. The lens the ICL stays in the same place. So you want to try and give yourself the most room. And of course, how much volt is going to depend on your anterior chamber depth and your angle dimensions. You know, you don't want to be closing angles. The second part of the principle from Saldívar which is of course, is it the central lens separation is the thing that we always measure. But if you have ultrasound, especially if you have high frequency ultrasound, you can measure the least separation point. And of course, with a high myopic ICL, this distance is going to be behind the iris. And you can't dilate the pupil to measure this because then the lens goes forward. So the only way to measure what the actual lens separation is in a high myope is with high frequency ultrasound like this. So I'm going to show you here a graph, which is, I wish I could tell you it was the first time I've shown this in the world, but it's the second. The first time was at the military refractive surgery meeting in San Diego in January, where I showed for the first time a graph, here it is, of the predicted volt by our equation against the achieved volt. So an attempted versus achieved volt. And this was 30 eyes that we had 1 month data on. We now have a lot more, actually. It's time to update this. But this is now prospective data, okay? This is eyes that we used the formula for that were not used to develop the formula. And we have about 50 or 60 eyes now, I think, to date, where we have used this prospectively. And here's what's amazing, okay? So we are predicting how high this this lens is going to be above the crystalline lens. 91% of the time, they're going to be within 300 microns of what we predicted. So we're now getting into the realm where we can choose the lens separation that we want to achieve in this eye, the ideal lens separation for this eye. And this is really exciting because when we talk about exchanges, we are not talking about lenses that are not the ideal size. We're talking about lenses, ICLs are in, that we are very worried about and will not leave in the eye, and we must exchange them because of a serious safety concern. And I have colleagues around that say it's 1%. I have colleagues that say it's 5%. So the percent exchange rate, whatever it is, it's too high because it should be 0, because it is a piece of plastic. We have measurements of the posterior chamber possible. I mean, this is not new technology. It's not that it's not commercially available. It is commercially available technology. There's no reason now why we shouldn't be predicting the lens volt for our patients in the most accurate way possible to avoid exchanges. So let me show you the prospective data on those eyes. And prospectively, normalizing to 500 because we were choosing lenses to go in at different heights. But this is the prospective data. We actually got an interquartile range of 163 microns down from 249. And if we look at this in the context of all of the other formulas, the range has gone down. Everything's gone down. Everything is tighter. And so the presumption is, and obviously we're going to have to do hundreds of eyes to prove this. The presumption is that the outliers are now going to become inliers. And not only should our exchange rate, and I'm hoping that it could go down to nearly 0, but we're also going to be able to add to that and give patients an ICL volt that will be for their AC depth, for their angle anatomy, and give them the maximum longevity for this amazing device in their eye. So I thank you very much for your attention on this subject. That QR code is for the ICLsizing.com website, not difficult to remember. I will mention that we incorporate this into our forefront refractive surgery courses that we give in London twice a year. Obviously, the June meeting is now be converted to an online meeting. If you want any information about this, we have a whole day on LASIK. It's expert LASIK technique, flaps for life. Presbyopia correction is a whole day, including cornea and lens, multifocals, extended depth of field, the whole subject tackled. And of course, we teach SMILE based on our textbook, which I think many of you have already given the honor of signing for you. And I want to finish with a little plug here for the ISRS, because obviously, if you're on this call, if you're on this lecture, and you're not a member of the ISRS, that's not a good thing, because the membership is only a couple of $100. And for that, you get the journal, which is worth a couple of $100. And plus, you get access to all of the other great materials on the ISRS website. So I'm not in the politics of the ISRS whatsoever, but I think it's a terribly important meeting and a terribly important society that all refractive surgeons, I believe, should